Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Tuhani Ismail. I will be the person who will report our topic entitled Philippine History, Species for Conflict and Controversies. So let's go. Learning objectives. At the end of the lesson, students can interpret historical events using primary sources, recognize the multiplicity of interpretation that can be read from a historical text, identify the advantages and disadvantages of employing critical tools in interpreting events through primary sources, and number 4, demonstrate ability to argue for or against a particular issue using primary sources. Making sense of the past, historical interpretation. History is a study of the past, but a more contemporary definition is centered on how it impacts the present through its consequences. Geoffrey Bancroft defines history as attempt to discover, on the basic fragmentary evidence, the significant things about the past. He also notes history we read, though based on fact, it's strictly speaking not factual at all, but a series of accepted judgments, such as judgment of historians on how the past should be seen, make the foundation of historical interpretation. History is the study of the past, according to or Geoffrey defined history as attempt to discover. He also notes the history we read is based on fact, but according to him, the history should be acceptance of how the historian judgment or how they judge the past and how this scene is the best on the foundation of historical interpretation. Historians utilize the fact collected from primary sources of history and then draw their intended audience may understand the historical event, a process that in essence makes sense of the past. The premise not all the primary sources are accessible to a general audience, and without a proper training and background, a non-historian interpreting a primary source may do more harm than a good. A primary source may even cause misunderstanding, sometimes even resulting in more problems. So here they say that historians utilize facts collected from primary sources. It is said that not all the audience are accessible to access the primary sources, and the non-historian would interpret the primary sources would cause more harm than a good, and even resort it resort even resulting in more problems than the good. Interpretation of the past therefore vary according to who reads the primary source, when it was read, and how it was read. As the student of history, we must be well equipped to recognize the different types of interpretations, why these may differ from each other, and how to critically shift these interpretations through historical evaluations. Interpretation of the history event changes over time. Thus, it is important skill for a student of history to track these changes and in attempt to understand the past. Many of the things we accept as true about the past not be the case anymore, just because these were taught taught to us. Facts. When we were young does not mean that it is set in stone. History is, after all, a construct, and as a construct, it is open for interpretations. There might be conflicting and competing accounts of the past that want attention and can be impact the way we view our country's history and identify. It is important, therefore, to subject the evaluation not only for primary source, but also the historical interpretation of the same, to ensure the current interpretation is reliable to support our acceptance of events of the past. Oo nga naman. It is important for a student of history to understand the different types of interpretations and how may differ from each other. Likewise, when we see when we study the primary sources or where the historian then interpret the primary sources is not the same in nowadays and then conflicting to each other. As a student, we need to understand the different kind of interpretations and um, it is and believe that it is reliable in our acceptance because it causes a lot of misunderstanding, especially that history is very difficult subjects. It may be um, uh, a story of the past that it is really important to study for. Multi-perspectivity. With several possibilities of interpreting the past, another important concept that we must note is multi-perspectivity. This can be defined as a way of looking historical events, personality, developments, culture, and society from different perspectives. This means that there is a multitude of a way by which we can view the world. Of each could be equally valid at the same time equally partial as well historical writing is, by definition, biased, partial, and contains preconceptions. The historian decides on what sources to use, what interpretation to make more apparent, depending on what and its historian may misinterpret evidence, attending to those that suggest that a certain event happened and then ignore the rest goes against the evidence. Historians may omit significant facts about their subject which make the interpretation unbalanced. Historians may impose a certain ideology to their subject which may not be appropriate to the period the subject was formed. Historian may also provide a single cause for an event, considering another possible cause explanation of said events. This just may of the way a historian may fail in historical reference, description, and interpretation with multi-perspectivity as an approach in history. We understand the historical interpretations, content, discrepancy, contradictions, ambiguities, and are often focus of dissent. We know that interpreting the past has several ways, but multi-perspectivity gives in a way or defines the way of looking historical event, personality, development, culture, society from different perspectives, and this means that we can view the world in different kind of perspectives in different kind of view. So, historical, the historian decide on what he used, maybe the primary sources, secondary sources, and other sources. But it is important to note to look for the authenticity and truthfulness because the historian shouldn't add his ideology, the um, suggestion of other historian that may mislead for the history or may result for misunderstanding or even cause inappropriate for the subject of that period. And it is important to know that with multi-perspectivity as an approach in history, we understand the historical interpretation, content, discrepancy, contradictions, ambiguities, and more often focus on the dissent. Exploring multi-perspectivity in history requires incorporating source materials that reflect different views of an event in history, because singular historical narratives do not provide the space into require and investigate. Different resources that counter each other may create spaces for more investigation and research, while providing evidence for those truths that these sources agree on. Different kinds of sources also provide different historical truth. Official documents mean not different aspects for the past than, say, a manure of an ordinary person on the same event. Different historical agents create different historical truth. And while this may be the burden, some work for the historian, it also renders more validity to the historical scholarship. Taking this in a close regard in the regarding on historical interpretations, it provides for the audience a more complex but also more complete and richer understanding of the past. Exploring multi-perspective in history is required incorporating source materials because single narratives do not provide spaces and investigation, but more narratives that contradict into each other, providing more spaces in investigation and research. Different kind of sources also provide truth, but to generalize this multi-perspectivity, taking or reading historical event, we should be widening our knowledge about how we understand the past and how we more complex to understand what is the truth, who to say the truth, and um, disregarding the mislead understanding or disregarding the historian who used another way to interpret the history by using ideology or another ways just to interpret the history in the past. Case number 1. Where did the first Catholic Mass take place in the Philippines? Popularity of knowing where the first happened in history has been an easy way to trivialize history, but his case study will not focus on the significance or lack thereof of the site of the first Catholic Mass in the Philippines, but rather use it as historical graphical event. Historiographical event. Historiographical event. Butuan has been long believed as the site of the first Mass. In fact, this has been the case for 3 centuries, culminating in the erection of Monumentum in 1872 near Augustine River, which commemorates the expedition's arrival and celebration of Mass on April 15, 21. The Butuan claim had been based on rather elementary reading of primary sources from elementary event. Towards the end of the 19th century and the start of the 19th century, together with increasing scholarship on the history of the Philippines, a more nuanced reading of available events was made, which brought to light more considerations in going against the more accepted interpretation of first Mass in the Philippines, more, made both by Spanish and Filipino scholars. It must be noted that there are only two primary sources that historians refer to in identifying the site of the first Mass. One is the log kept by Francisco Albo, a pilot one of the Magellan ship Trinidad. He was one of the 18 survivors who returned in the Sebastian Elcano on the ship Victoria after they cur- circumnavigated the world. The another and the more complete was the account by Antonio Pigitepa, Primo Viogo Almondo, first voyage around the world. Pigipeta, like Albo, was the member of the Magellan expedition, an eyewitness of the event, particularly in the first Mass.